Right now, the world believes America is about to return to the surface of the moon. It is not. The mission everyone is celebrating, Artemis 3, was quietly stripped of its moon landing, and almost no one was told. What was sold for years as the first boots on the moon since 1972 has become something far smaller, for a reason that should genuinely unsettle you. The machine America needs to land has not been built, and the company building it just became one of the most valuable on Earth. Stay with me until the end, because you are about to understand who actually controls the road back to the moon, and why it may no longer be us. Drop a comment with whether you still believe we can get back to the moon on our own, and what you think is really going on here. Subscribe to the Quiet Archivist so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's get into it. There is a sentence that almost nobody read this week, and it changes everything you think you know about America's return to the moon. In the second week of June, 2026, NASA stood up at the Johnson Space Center and announced the crew for Artemis 3. The headlines wrote themselves: astronauts named, back to the moon, the next giant leap, and almost every one of those headlines was, in a quiet and very specific way, wrong. Because if you read past the announcement, past the names and the smiling photographs, you find something the celebration was carefully arranged not to say out loud. Artemis 3, the mission sold for years as humanity's return to the surface of the moon, is no longer a moon landing at all. Let me say that again, slowly, because it is the kind of thing that sounds like it must be an exaggeration, and it is not. The mission that was supposed to put human boots back on the lunar surface for the first time since 1972 has been quietly redefined into something far smaller. According to NASA's own description of the flight, Artemis 3 will now be a rendezvous and docking test in low Earth orbit. The crew will fly up. They will practice linking their Orion capsule to a lunar lander, and they will come home. They will not go to the moon. The actual landing, the part everyone has been waiting half a century for, has been pushed down the line to Artemis 4, now aimed at 2028 or later. Here is what makes this so strange, and so worth an hour of your time. Nobody lied to you exactly. There was no press release that said we are canceling the moon landing. Instead, the truth arrived in fragments, scattered across mission descriptions and budget documents and schedule updates, each one technically public, none of them ever assembled into a single plain sentence that an ordinary person would notice. The website language changed. The mission profile changed. The crew was announced without the word landing anywhere near it, and the public was left with the impression it was always given that Artemis 3 means Americans walking on the moon, while the reality underneath that impression was quietly hollowed out. I want to be clear from the very start about what kind of story this is, because this channel does not deal in fantasy, and I am not about to start. This is not a video about Artemis being fake. The hardware is real. The rocket is real. The capsule is real, and it has already flown around the moon once without a crew. This is not about a hoax. It is about something more uncomfortable than a hoax, because a hoax would at least be a single clean lie you could expose. This is about a slow, fragmented, deniable downgrade of the most important mission in the program, carried out in plain sight, narrated to the public in a way that let everyone keep believing the old story, while the new one quietly took its place. You might be wondering why you should care about the precise definition of one space mission, and that is a fair question. So let me answer it directly before we go any further. You should care because this is not a small or cheap undertaking. Artemis is one of the most expensive things the United States government does, a program that runs into the tens of billions of dollars, paid for by ordinary people who were told, in plain language, that this money was buying a return to the surface of the moon. When the product quietly changes from a landing to a rehearsal, and the people paying for it are not clearly told, that is not a trivial bookkeeping matter. It is a question of whether a public institution still feels it owes the public a straight account of what their money is actually buying. And there is more than money at stake. There is the story a country tells itself about what it can still do. For 60 years, the moon landing has been the thing America points to when it wants to believe it can accomplish the impossible. Quietly hollowing out the mission meant to revive that feeling, while letting everyone believe it is still intact, does something subtle to a nation's sense of itself. It lets the symbol survive while the substance drains away. That is worth an hour of anyone's attention, whether or not you have ever cared about a rocket in your life. And when you ask the simple question, why, you do not get a comfortable answer. You get a chain of facts that leads somewhere genuinely unsettling. The reason Artemis 3 is no longer a landing is that the thing it needs to land does not yet exist in working form. And the reason that matters, the reason it should keep you up at night a little, is what it reveals about who actually controls America's path back to the moon. Because it is no longer NASA. Not entirely. Not anymore. So over the next hour, I am going to walk you through the whole thing, piece by piece, the way it should have been told the first time. What Artemis 3 was supposed to be, and how much of it has quietly vanished. Why the landing had to be removed, and what that says about the machines we have, and the ones we do not. And the part that ties it all together. The part that almost no coverage connected to this announcement, even though it happened in the very same week. Because to understand what they are not telling you about Artemis 3, you first have to understand exactly how much was promised. And the size of that promise is the first thing that will surprise you. To understand what has been taken away, you have to remember what was offered. And for years, what was offered was enormous. Artemis 3 was never meant to be just another flight. It was meant to be the moment. The whole Artemis program, named for the twin sister of Apollo, was built around one shining objective, and that objective lived inside Artemis 3. It was going to be the first time human beings stood on the surface of the moon since December of 1972. Think about how long ago that is. The last person to walk on the moon did so more than 53 years ago. Every single human being who has been born in the last half century has lived their entire life on a planet whose people could not reach the surface of their own moon. Artemis 3 was supposed to end that. It was not just going to repeat Apollo either. It was going to go somewhere Apollo never dared. The plan called for a landing near the lunar South Pole, a region the old missions avoided entirely because it is harder and more dangerous to reach. The South Pole matters because tucked inside its permanently shadowed craters, in pockets of darkness that have not seen sunlight in billions of years, there is water ice. Water means drinking water, breathable oxygen, and even rocket fuel that could one day be made on the moon itself, rather than hauled up from Earth at staggering cost. The South Pole is not just a destination, it is the doorway to staying. Artemis 3 was supposed to open that door. It helps to sit with just how long the wait has been, because the number is easy to say and hard to actually feel. The last crewed moon landing, Apollo 17, lifted off the lunar surface in December of 1972. Since then, not one human being has traveled beyond low Earth orbit. We have built space stations, flown reusable rockets, landed robots on Mars, and sent probes past the edge of the solar system. But the actual distance a human can travel from the Earth has not increased in over half a century. It has, if anything, shrunk. An entire civilization's worth of technological progress has happened, and the farthest a person can go is still a few hundred miles up, the same as it has been for 53 years. Artemis 3 was meant to be the mission that finally broke that long, strange stall, the one that let a new generation see human beings stand somewhere other than this planet for the first time in their lives. NASA even leaned into that framing, talking about an Artemis generation, the young people who would grow up watching the moon become a place humans go again. That is the weight that was resting on this one flight. Not just a landing, but the end of the longest pause in the history of human exploration. Which is exactly why removing the landing from it, quietly, is so much heavier than it might first appear. And there was a human promise stitched into the mission too, one NASA repeated for years in public, in speeches, on its own websites. Artemis 3, the agency said again and again, would carry the first woman and the first person of color to the surface of the moon. After a half-century in which the only people to leave boot prints up there were a small group of men who all looked rather similar, this was meant to be the mission that finally changed the face of who gets to go. It was written into the program's identity. It was, for a long time, the single most repeated sentence in all of Artemis messaging. So, watch what happened to that promise, because it is the first thread to quietly come loose. In March of 2025, NASA removed the language about the first woman and the first person of color from its Artemis web pages. The words simply disappeared. When people noticed, and they did notice, the agency said that the change in language did not indicate a change in crew assignments. Nothing to see here, in other words. The promise is intact. We have just stopped writing it down. And then, 15 months later, in June of 2026, the crew was announced. 4 astronauts, all of them men. Now, I am not here to tell you who should or should not be assigned to a spaceflight. That is not my lane, and reasonable people will argue about it from every direction. What I am here to do is show you the shape of the thing, because the shape is undeniable. A promise was made, loudly, for years. The words were quietly deleted. The agency insisted the deletion meant nothing. And then the mission was crewed in a way that ran directly counter to the promise that had supposedly not changed. Whatever you think about the politics of it, that is a sequence that erodes trust. And it erodes trust precisely because it was handled in the same fragmented, deniable way as everything else about this mission. Say one thing for years. Quietly remove it. Insist nothing changed. Deliver the opposite. Here is the thing to hold on to, though, because it is bigger than the crew. The vanished diversity promise is not actually the main event. It is the warning light on the dashboard, the first visible sign that the story being told and the story actually unfolding had come apart. Because at the very same time the words were disappearing from the website, something much larger was being removed from the mission itself, not a sentence. The moon landing. And to understand why NASA pulled the single most important objective out of its single most important mission, you have to look at the one piece of this entire enterprise that nobody has been able to make work on time. You have to look at the lander. Every story about why Artemis 3 stopped being a moon landing ends at the same place, and it is not a place most people expect. It is not the rocket. The rocket works. It is not the capsule. The capsule works and has already flown around the moon. The problem, the entire problem, is the one machine in the whole architecture that has to actually touch the lunar surface. And that machine does not yet exist in a form that can carry a human being safely down and back up. The problem is the lander. You have to understand how Artemis is built to see why this single gap brings the whole thing to a halt. Apollo carried its own lander. The Saturn V rocket, the command module, and the lunar module were all one integrated system, designed and directed under one roof. Artemis is different. NASA builds the giant rocket called the Space Launch System, and it builds the Orion Crew capsule. And together, those can carry astronauts all the way to orbit around the moon. But here's the catch that almost nobody outside the program fully appreciates. Orion cannot land. It was never designed to. It can reach lunar orbit and circle the moon, but to actually get down to the surface and back, the crew has to transfer into a completely separate vehicle, a human landing system, built not by NASA, but by a private company under contract. No lander, no landing. It is that simple, and it is that fragile. So who is building the lander? The primary contract went to SpaceX, and the vehicle is a version of its enormous Starship. And on paper, Starship is magnificent, a spacecraft larger than anything that has ever flown. But to turn it into a moon lander, SpaceX has to solve a problem that no one, anywhere, in the entire history of spaceflight, has ever solved at scale. To reach the moon, the Starship lander has to be refueled in orbit. Not topped off a little, filled. And the propellant it uses has to be kept incredibly cold. So cold that it is constantly trying to boil away. Transferring that kind of super chilled fuel from one spacecraft to another, in the weightlessness of orbit, without losing it, has never been done as an operational capability. And it does not take just one refueling flight. Current plans call for a whole series of tanker launches, possibly a dozen or more, each one carrying fuel up to a depot in orbit, before a single Starship can head for the moon with enough propellant to land and return. Think about everything that has to go right in that sequence. A dozen launches, on schedule, in close succession. Fuel transferred between ships in orbit, repeatedly, without dangerous loss, using technology still being invented. Then, an uncrewed test landing on the moon to prove the whole thing works, before NASA would ever dream of putting astronauts on board. None of that has happened yet. Independent safety reviewers inside NASA's own oversight structure have warned that the Starship lander may be years behind schedule, and the most sober estimates put it at least 2 years late, with more delay expected. To really understand the size of this obstacle, compare it to how Apollo did the same job, because the contrast is stunning. The Apollo lunar module was small, simple by comparison, and it flew to the moon fully fueled on a single rocket. One launch, one vehicle, one trip. The Starship approach is something else entirely. Because the vehicle is so enormous and the journey so demanding, it cannot carry all its own fuel from the ground. Instead, the plan is to launch the lander into orbit nearly empty, and then send up a parade of separate tanker ships, one after another, each delivering a load of propellant to a storage depot waiting in orbit. Only after that depot has been filled, across many launches, can a tanker transfer the fuel into the lander, which can finally light its engines and head for the moon. Every single one of those transfers involves moving propellant chilled to hundreds of degrees below zero between two spacecraft in freefall, fighting the constant tendency of that fuel to warm up and boil away into space. Lose too much to boil off between launches, and the math simply does not close. No one has ever run this play. It exists in test plans and animations, not in operational reality. And remember, even once it works, NASA would require an uncrewed Starship to actually land on the moon and prove the whole sequence is survivable before a single astronaut climbs aboard. Stack all of that up, and you begin to see why the landing did not just slip by a few months. The entire chain of firsts required to make it possible is still ahead of us, not behind. The lander is not a vehicle that is nearly ready. It is a vehicle whose hardest problems have not yet been solved, even once. And there is a history behind this that makes the delay even more pointed. When NASA first chose a company to build the lander for the return to the moon, the decision was contested almost immediately, tangled in formal protests and legal challenges between the competing firms, which itself ate up precious time before serious work could even begin. Then came the long grind of actually building something no one had built before, against deadlines that were ambitious from the very start and slipped almost from the moment they were set. By the time NASA reopened the competition and quietly invited new bidders to propose their own landers, the message was unmistakable. The agency was no longer confident the original plan would deliver a working vehicle in time, and was hunting for alternatives while the clock kept running. None of that is the behavior of a program quietly confident it is about to land humans on the moon. It is the behavior of a program scrambling to find any path to the surface at all. This is not a small slip. This is the keystone of the entire return to the moon, and it is not ready. And it is not only SpaceX. NASA, wisely, did not want to depend on a single company, so a second lander was commissioned from Blue Origin, a vehicle called Blue Moon Mark II. But that one is behind as well. As recently as last year, the design had not yet cleared its own internal review cleanly. The company was still being told to reduce the vehicle's weight, to mature its engines, to improve its fuel margins, with a long list of formal concerns still left open. 2 landers, 2 companies, and not one of them ready to safely carry a crew to the surface on the timeline the mission needed. NASA grew so frustrated that it did something telling. It reopened the competition, inviting other companies to pitch their own landers, an open admission that the current plan had stalled. So now put yourself in NASA's position, and the descope suddenly makes a grim kind of sense. You have a rocket that works. You have a capsule that works. You have a crew, trained and ready. And you have no machine that can actually land them. What do? You could wait and let the mission slip year after year with nothing to show for it. Or you could fly the crew anyway. Send them up to practice docking with the lander hardware in the safety of low Earth orbit. Keep the program moving, keep the cadence alive, and quietly move the actual landing to a later mission. That is exactly what happened. Artemis 3 became a rehearsal because the thing it was rehearsing for could not yet be built. And that decision, defensible as it is on its own terms, opens onto a much larger and far more uncomfortable truth about who is really steering this whole enterprise. Because if NASA cannot land on the moon without a private company's machine, then the question of when America returns to the moon is no longer entirely NASA's to answer. I want to come back to that crew now, because there is more in this announcement than 4 names, and the way it was handled is a small, perfect model of the whole pattern. Remember the sequence, because the sequence is the story. For years, NASA promised the world that Artemis 3 would carry the first woman and the first person of color to the lunar surface. It was not a quiet hope tucked away in a planning document. It was a centerpiece, stated from podiums, printed on the agency's own pages, repeated until it became one of the best known facts about the entire program. This was going to be the mission that finally changed who gets to stand on another world. Then, in the spring of 2025, the words went away. Not with an announcement, not with an explanation, just an edit. One day the promise was on the website, and then it was not. When journalists and the public noticed the deletion, NASA offered a careful line. The change in language, it said, does not indicate a change in crew assignments. Read that sentence again, because it is a small masterpiece of saying nothing. It does not say the promise stands. It does not say the promise is gone. It says only that removing the words should not be taken to mean anything about who flies. It is the language of an institution keeping every option open while reassuring everyone that nothing is happening. This is the part that I think matters most for how you read everything NASA and every other large institution tells you from here on out. There is a specific style of communication that organizations adopt when the truth has become inconvenient, but an outright lie is too risky. They do not lie. Lying can be caught and punished. Instead, they manage. They delete a sentence here and decline to write one there. They answer the question that was not asked and let the real question hang in the air unanswered. They release the awkward facts, but only in the dense, technical documents that they know almost no one will read, so that later, if challenged, they can say with a straight face that the information was always public. Every individual move is defensible. We updated our website. We released our budget. We described the mission accurately in the technical appendix. And yet, the cumulative effect is that the public ends up believing something that is no longer true. which is precisely the outcome the managing was designed to produce. Once you learn to recognize that style, you cannot unsee it, and you will notice it far beyond the space program. The Artemis 3 announcement is simply an unusually clean specimen of it, because the gap between what people believe and what is actually planned is so wide you could fly a rocket through it. And then the crew was named, and it was 4 men. Whatever was true behind the scenes, the visible arc is impossible to miss. A promise made for years, the words quietly erased, an official reassurance that the erasure was meaningless, and then an outcome that directly contradicts the original promise. I am deliberately not going to stand here and argue the politics of crew selection with you, because that argument will rage no matter what I say, and it is not the point. The point is the method. The point is that this is the exact same move we have already seen with the landing itself. State an ambitious thing loudly. Remove it quietly. Deny that the removal means anything. Deliver something smaller. Once you see that pattern, you start to see it everywhere in this announcement, and it changes how you read the whole thing. The celebration of the crew was real, and the astronauts deserve every bit of respect for the danger they are signing up for. But the celebration also functioned, whether by design or by drift, as a kind of misdirection. Look at these brave people going back to the moon, and while the public looked at the people, it did not look quite so hard at the fact that they are not, in fact, going to the moon, not on this flight. The human story was front and center, precisely where the mission story had quietly collapsed. That is not a conspiracy. It does not require a secret meeting. It only requires an institution that has learned it is easier to let people keep believing a beautiful old story than to stand up and explain an awkward new one. But why would an agency built on some of the most brilliant engineers and scientists alive end up communicating this way? Not because they are villains. Because they are caught. They are trapped between a public that was promised the moon, a political environment that shifts under their feet with every change of administration, a set of private contractors whose timelines they cannot fully control, and a rival on the other side of the world moving fast. When you are squeezed from that many directions at once, the path of least resistance is to say as little as possible, as quietly as possible, and to let the old optimistic narrative coast along on its own momentum. The result is not a lie. It is something subtler and, in its own way, more corrosive. It is a slow drift between what is said and what is true, until the gap between them grows wide enough for a moon landing to disappear into it without anyone quite noticing. And that gap, that widening space between the story and the reality, is where the real revelation of this whole affair lives. Because the deepest thing they are not telling you is not about a crew or even about a canceled landing. It is about a transfer of power so large that we have not even built the words to discuss it properly. It is about who owns the road back to the moon, and the clue that cracks it open was sitting in the financial news that very same week, in a headline almost nobody thought to place next to the Artemis announcement. Here is the detail that ties this entire story together, and almost no one connected it to the Artemis news, even though the two things happened within days of each other. In the very same week that NASA effectively admitted it cannot reach the surface of the moon without a private company's lander, that private company became one of the most valuable corporations on the face of the Earth. On the 12th of June, 2026, SpaceX began trading its stock publicly for the first time, and the market valued it at roughly $1.77 trillion. Trillion with a T. Let that number sit for a moment. The company on which America's return to the moon now depends is worth more than the entire economies of most nations. Put those two facts side by side, because together they say something neither says alone. Fact 1. NASA cannot land on the moon without a commercial lander. Fact 2. The leading maker of that lander is now a publicly traded company worth nearly $2 trillion, answerable first and foremost to its shareholders. For the whole of the space age until now, the road to the moon ran through a government agency accountable, at least in theory, to the public. Today, that road runs through a corporate balance sheet. The pace of humanity's return to the moon is now set in large part by the development schedule and the business priorities of a private firm that NASA can contract with, plead with, and pressure, but cannot command. To feel how big a shift that is, compare it to how we did this the first time. Apollo was a single, unified national effort. The rocket, the command module, the lunar module, all of it was designed and built under NASA's direction, by contractors who answered to NASA's program, toward a goal NASA defined. When the country decided to go to the moon in the 1960s, the country, through its space agency, controlled every link in the chain that got it there. Now, in fairness, the shift toward private companies did not happen by accident or by foolishness, and I would be doing you a disservice if I painted it as a simple mistake. There were real and good reasons for it. The old way of doing things, where the government owned and operated every vehicle, was extraordinarily expensive and often painfully slow. When NASA began handing more responsibility to commercial companies, it got some genuine wins in return. Private firms started carrying cargo and then astronauts to the space station for a fraction of what the old approach cost, and they did it with reusable rockets that landed themselves, something the government programs had never managed. The commercial model, for all its risks, has delivered real savings and real innovation, and the people who championed it were not naive. They were trying to make spaceflight cheaper and faster so that the nation could do more of it. That part of the story is true, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to make a cleaner villain. But every arrangement has a price, and the price of this one is the thing we are watching play out with Artemis 3. When you hand the most critical piece of your mission to a private company, you also hand them a measure of control over your timeline, your priorities, and ultimately, your ability to deliver on your promises. A government agency can be ordered by the public, through its representatives, to make the moon a priority. A publicly traded corporation answers first to its shareholders, and its shareholders care about returns, not about flags. Most of the time, those interests overlap enough that the partnership works. But when they diverge, when finishing a moonlander on NASA's schedule conflicts with the company's own commercial ambitions, there is no law of nature that says the mission wins. That is the quiet cost that was always baked into the bargain, and Artemis 3 is the moment the bill came due. Artemis is a fundamentally different animal. NASA owns some of the links, the rocket and the capsule, but the most critical link of all, the machine that actually touches the moon, belongs to someone else. And that someone else now has a market value, a stock price, and a fiduciary duty to investors that exists entirely apart from any national mission to explore. I want to be careful and fair here, because this is exactly the kind of fact that gets twisted into something it is not. NASA does not take orders from SpaceX. There is no secret room where a corporation runs the space agency. The relationship is a contract, openly signed, debated in public budgets, overseen by congressional committees. So, let us dispatch the cartoon version of this story right now. This is not a tale of a shadowy company secretly seizing control of the government. But once you set the cartoon aside, what remains is arguably more significant, because it is real and it is structural, and nobody chose it on purpose. America's ability to carry out its flagship human spaceflight mission is now genuinely dependent on the timeline, the technology, and the commercial health of a private enterprise. That is not a conspiracy. It is just the new architecture of how we reach space, and it deserves to be discussed honestly instead of hidden behind crew photographs. Here is the uncomfortable corollary that follows from all of it. In the Apollo era, if the public wanted to go faster, it could, through its elected leaders, simply decide to spend more and demand more, because the government controlled the whole machine, end to end. Today, that lever is far weaker. You cannot order a private company to finish a spacecraft by sheer act of political will, not the way you could once direct a government program. The nation can offer more money. It can apply pressure. It can threaten to take its business elsewhere. But the actual pace of progress now lives inside a corporation's own engineering choices and business priorities. That is a genuine transfer of power, away from the public and toward private hands. And it happened so gradually, one contract at a time over the better part of 2 decades, that there was never a single moment when anyone got to stand up and vote on whether it was a good idea. It simply became the way things are, quietly, the same way everything else in this story became the way things are. And Artemis 3 is the first time the consequences of that long, silent drift have been impossible to look away from. And this matters far beyond accounting, because there is a clock running that does not care about any of our internal arrangements. On the other side of the world, China has stated plainly that it intends to land its own astronauts on the moon by the year 2030. That is not a distant aspiration. That is a hard target, backed by a program that has been hitting its milestones with unsettling consistency. Every time Artemis slips, every time a landing becomes a docking test, every time a lander falls another 2 years behind, the gap between an American return and a Chinese arrival narrows. And so the descope of Artemis 3 is not just a domestic scheduling story. It is a question about whether the next human beings to stand on the moon will plant a flag that looks like the one planted there in 1969, or a very different one. That is the stake hiding underneath a mission that got quietly turned into a rehearsal. Whenever a story like this surfaces, the suspicion arrives right behind it, and I think the suspicion deserves to be taken seriously rather than mocked, because underneath most of it is a reasonable person sensing that they are not getting the whole truth. So let us go through the theories this announcement will spawn, one by one, and sort the real from the imagined, because some of them are nonsense, and at least one of them is pointing at something true. The loudest reaction will be the simplest. Artemis is fake. The whole thing is theater. NASA cannot actually go back to the moon and never could. And I understand the instinct, especially when you watch a moon landing quietly turn into an orbit test. But this one does not survive contact with the evidence. The hardware is real, and it has flown. Back in 2022, an uncrewed Orion capsule rode the Space Launch System all the way out, looped around the moon, and came home. That happened. The rocket exists, the capsule exists, the engineering is real, and so are the struggles. What you are watching is not a fake program pretending to work. It is a real program failing to work on schedule, which is a completely different thing. Struggling and staged are not the same, and every piece of evidence points at the first, not the second. The second theory is sharper and closer to the truth. They are hiding the fact that Artemis 3 is not a landing anymore. And here I am going to partly agree with you, which may surprise you. The instinct is correct, even though the word hiding is slightly wrong. NASA did disclose the change. It is there in the mission descriptions, in the budget documents, in the schedule updates. The information is technically public, but it was never delivered in a single, plain, honest sentence that an ordinary person would catch. There was no moment where the agency said, clearly, the moon landing has been removed from Artemis 3 and moved to a later flight. Instead, the truth was scattered into fragments that only a specialist would assemble. That is not a sealed secret. It is something I would call structural neglect, an institution failing to communicate plainly because plain communication would be politically painful. The cover-up version is wrong. The accountability failure is real, and you were right to feel it. There is a fifth reaction worth heading off to, because it tends to surface whenever a program stumbles. And it is the claim that the crew themselves must have been chosen for the wrong reasons, picked for show rather than skill. I want to push back on that one hard, because it is both unfair and a distraction. The astronauts assigned to this flight are, by any measure, among the most rigorously trained and tested human beings on the planet. Whatever has gone wrong with Artemis 3, it has nothing to do with the competence of the people willing to strap themselves to a rocket and ride it into orbit. Aiming your frustration at the crew is exactly the kind of misdirection that lets the actual decisions, made far above the astronauts, slide by unexamined. The crew is not the problem. The crew is the part of this story that still works exactly as it should. The failure lives in the program's schedule, its contracts, and its candor, none of which are within an astronaut's power to fix. And that is really the thread running through every one of these theories, the true and the false alike. Each of them is reaching for a simple human villain, a liar or a fraud or a puppet master or an unqualified diversity pick, because a villain is satisfying and easy to be angry at. But the honest picture has no single villain in it. It has an agency boxed in by forces it cannot control, communicating badly because honesty would be costly, depending on machines that are not finished, built by companies it cannot command, while a rival closes in. That is harder to be angry at, because there is no one face to point to. But it is the truth, and the truth is what you came here for. And maybe the most revealing thing of all is how little of this was connected by the coverage you actually saw. The crew announcement was reported widely. The stock debut was reported widely. The lander delays have been reported, here and there, for years. Every individual piece of this story has been sitting in public view. What was missing was the act of laying them next to each other, of noticing that the agency confessing it cannot reach the moon alone, and the company it depends on becoming worth nearly $2 trillion were the same story, told in the same week, about the same future. The pieces were never hidden. They were just never assembled. And an unassembled truth is, for most people, no truth at all. That is the quiet machinery by which something enormous can happen in plain sight and still go unseen. The third theory will focus on the crew and will claim the all-male selection proves some deliberate agenda in one direction or another. I have already told you I am not going to litigate that fight, and I am not because it pulls us away from what is actually demonstrable. What is demonstrable is the gap between the promise and the delivery, and the agency's refusal to simply explain it. You do not need a theory about motives to be unsettled by an institution that says one thing for years, deletes it without a word, and then does the opposite. The honest demand here is not for a villain. It is for a straight answer, which has not been given. And the fourth theory is the big one. A private company secretly controls NASA now. This is the one I most want you to hold carefully, because it is both wrong and important. It is wrong in its cartoon form. There is no corporate puppet master. But strip away the melodrama and look at the structure, and you find something genuinely real underneath. NASA's flagship mission is now gated by a private company's schedule and commercial priorities, and that company answers to its shareholders before it answers to any dream of exploration. That is not a secret cabal. It is an openly contracted dependency, and it is arguably more consequential than any cabal because it was not imposed by villains. It simply grew, contract by contract, until one day the road to the moon ran through a corporation worth nearly $2 trillion, and almost no one had stopped to notice what that meant. Dispatch the puppet master. Keep the dependency. The dependency is the real story. So when you strip it all down, what they are not telling you about Artemis 3 is not a single juicy secret you can hold in your hand. It is something quieter and harder to photograph. They are not telling you, in plain words, that the landing is gone from this mission. They are not telling you that the promise about who would make that landing has been reversed. They are not telling you that the reason for all of it is a machine that does not yet work. And they are not telling you that, taken together, these facts mean America can no longer reach the surface of the moon on its own power and on its own schedule. None of those things are hidden exactly. They are just never said together, out loud, in a way that would force everyone to look directly at what has happened. Which leaves one last question, the one this whole story has been circling from the start. So let us stand back and look at the whole shape of it, now that all the pieces are on the table. A mission that was meant to return humans to the moon has become a practice run in Earth orbit. A promise about who would take that historic step has been quietly reversed. The reason for both is a lander that does not yet exist in working form, built by private companies that are years behind. And the deepest consequence, the one almost no coverage spoke aloud, is that the most powerful space agency in history can no longer place a human on the surface of the moon without depending on a corporation now worth nearly $2 trillion and answerable to its shareholders. Every one of those facts is public. Not one of them was ever said plainly, together, by the people who owed you the explanation. I think it is worth being honest about the fact that none of this is the result of villainy. It is easy, watching a moon landing dissolve into a docking test, to reach for a story about liars and schemers, and I have spent this whole video pulling you back from that reach, because it is the wrong one. What actually happened is more ordinary, and, in a way, more troubling. An agency made promises it could not fully control the means to keep. The means were handed to private companies whose schedules slipped. The political ground shifted underneath the program. A rival rose on the far side of the world. And caught in the middle of all of it, the people running the mission did what cornered institutions so often do. They said as little as possible, let the old hopeful story coast on its own momentum, and hoped the gap between the promise and the reality would not be noticed until it could somehow be closed. That is not a crime. It is a failure of candor. And candor is the one thing a mission like this most owes the public that pays for it. Picture, for a moment, what the honest version of this announcement would have sounded like, because the contrast tells you everything. Someone could have stood at that podium and said, plainly, that the moon landing has proven harder to reach than hoped, that the lander is not yet ready, and that Artemis 3 will therefore fly as a test mission in Earth orbit to keep the program moving, while the landing waits for Artemis 4. They could have explained the refueling problem in a few clear sentences. They could have addressed the changed crew promise directly instead of pretending nothing changed. It would have been a harder speech to give. It would have generated tougher headlines for a day or two. But it would have treated the public as adults capable of understanding a setback, and it would have preserved the one resource a space agency cannot rebuild once it is spent, which is trust. Instead, the choice was made to let the triumphant old story coast, and to hope no one laid the pieces side by side. That choice is the real subject of this video, more than any rocket or lander or crew. It is the choice to manage a perception rather than to tell a truth. Because, make no mistake, this is still an extraordinary thing that is being attempted. Returning humans to the moon after more than 53 years, and aiming not for a quick visit, but for the resource-rich South Pole and a foothold that might let us stay, is one of the hardest things our species has ever tried to do. The difficulty is not a scandal. The difficulty is the whole point. What is a scandal, or at least a quiet disgrace, is the decision to dress that difficulty up in the language of triumph, to announce a rehearsal as if it were a return, to let a nation believe it is about to walk on the moon, when what it is actually about to do is practice docking a few hundred miles above its own head. And so, we arrive back at the question this whole story has been circling. from its first minute, the one that turns out to be much harder than the one everyone thought they were asking. The question was supposed to be, when do we go back to the moon? That is the question the Artemis 3 announcement was meant to answer. And the answer everyone absorbed was, now, soon, with this crew. But read honestly, the announcement does not answer that question at all. It raises a far more difficult one. Can we still go back to the moon on our own at all? Can a country that once controlled every bolt of its journey to the lunar surface still get there under its own direction, on its own timeline, when the single machine that touches the surface belongs to someone else, and is not finished, and answers to a market rather than to a mission? I do not have a clean answer for you, and I would be lying if I pretended to. What I can tell you is that the next time you see a triumphant headline about astronauts and the moon and the next giant leap, you will know to read the sentence underneath it. You will know to ask whether the mission described is a landing or a rehearsal, whether the promise being made is one the speaker actually controls the means to keep, and whose machine and whose schedule and whose flag is really setting the pace. Because the truth about Artemis 3 was never hidden in a vault. It was hidden in plain language, scattered across documents nobody reads, sitting in a financial headline nobody connected, waiting for someone to lay the pieces side by side and say the simple thing out loud. The moon landing is gone from this mission, and the reason it is gone is that we may no longer be the ones who decide when we return.